They love Greek architecture, so they copy it, only they make it out of concrete so they instead of solid rock, so that they can do it quicker and cheaper. And then they adopt the basic governmental structure. They're fascinated with democracy, really, really fascinated with democracy. So as they're listening to all these tales of democracy emerging over in Greece, the Romans are sitting here, part of a confederation, that the Etruscans have put together in northern Italy, and they're being ruled over by a king. And they start thinking, we don't need no stinking king. And so when Athens is getting ready to rebel, Rome rebels first. And in the Revolution of 509, Rome rises up against the Etruscans, kills their king, and begins a war of independence that's going to last for over 100 years. Now this is important, because this is what the Romans do. The Romans fight because they want to feel safe. But as they fight, they win. And so they find themselves in control of more and more territory. It wasn't enough for the Romans to free their city from the Etruscans. Oh no, they had to drive the Etruscans further away. And so as they're driving the Etruscans further away, they're actually driving the Etruscans straight out of Italy. Funny, we actually have no idea what happened to the Etruscans when they left Italy, but they did. And so the Romans end up in charge of all that territory. Now they're going to have to figure out how to govern it. Do you make those people equal to you? Or do you rule over them? Do you adopt them in? Or do you rule over? It takes Rome a really long time to decide the answer to that question. So Rome has just defeated the Etruscans, and they're like, whoo, finally we can kick back and feel safe for a little bit. But oh no. Then they get attacked by the Celts. Now the Celts were any group, the Celts didn't call themselves the Celts. That's what the Romans called them. It's kind of like Christopher Columbus showing up and saying, Indians. You know, that's not what Native American tribes called themselves. So the Celts were any group that were different from the Romans who lived north of the Alps, wore a lot of animal skins. To the Roman point of view, they all smelled the same, they all looked the same, they all sound the same, so they're Celts. And they would frequently raid the Mediterranean and steal stuff. So they were always a danger. Julius Caesar will take care of that. But so the Celts came down and attacked the city of Rome, raided in 390, devastated a huge percentage of the city, cost 1,000 bars of gold for the Romans to get them to leave. The Romans are now freaking out. The Romans want to feel safe, so they build a new military. And they build a giant wall surrounding their city, and with that military, they start conquering. So in the 300s BC, the Romans turned their attention to all the various Latin-speaking tribes that were kind of in the middle there, in between the Etruscans and the Greeks, and they conquer those guys. And then they turn their attention to the Greeks, and they drive the Greeks out of southern Italy, and they take over all that. And here you go, Rome should feel safe, right? Yeah, they've got all of Italy now. They're the red boot. Ooh, red boots. How pretty. So they're the red boot. They should feel so safe. But see, here's the problem. Every time Rome conquers new land, it puts them closer to a new enemy. So now Rome's got somebody new to feel scared of. And this time it's the Carthaginians. This isn't the Etruscans. This isn't a small Latin-speaking tribe. This is the superpower of the Western Mediterranean. And Rome is going to fight not one, not two, but 3 wars with the Carthaginians. And the second Punic War, which is what these conflicts are called, almost destroyed Rome. That's the one where Hannibal comes across the Alps with the elephants. Only one elephant made it across the Alps, by the way. But and invaded Italy and did all kinds of damage. Now listen, this is important that you think about this. Rome knows this is going on. Rome knows they're in this horrible catch-22. We want to feel safe, so therefore we have to attack our enemies. But every time we attack our enemies, because we're really good at fighting, we win, and then we're in charge of new land, and we have to figure out how to govern it, and then that puts us closer to the next enemy. Rome knows this is going on. There are open debates about this and the wisdom of future wars in the Senate. But there are really 2 schools of thought here. There's the we want to be safe mentality, and then there is the isolationist mentality. And when the 2 groups are bickering and debating on the Senate floor, every single time the we want to be safe voice wins out. Rome doesn't want to expand. They're not setting out to be an empire. They want to be a polis. They want to be an independent little republic city, just leave us alone, but they want to be safe. So Rome conquered the world out of self-defense. That's the famous quote. They decided if there's an enemy out there that we're going to fight and war's going to be inevitable, by God, we are going to make sure that we dictate where and when the battle takes place. And we're going to fight on their turf, not ours. Because every time somebody gets close to Rome, it's really, really bad. So Rome defeats the Carthaginians. And then Rome takes on the Hellenistic kingdoms. They go get the Antigonid kingdom in Greece in I think it's 198, I think it is. And then they go get the Seleucid kingdom, which is basically Turkey, in 196 to 192, maybe 188. And then they kind of force Egypt, led by the Ptolemies, to willingly sign up. And Egypt, no one wants to invade Egypt. So Egypt gets a sweet deal. Egypt gets to keep their own leader, Pharaoh. Cleopatra will be the last one. And their own army. And Octavian's going to regret that decision was ever made. But so Egypt is now part of the Roman world as well. Now there's a big fat X over Judea, because remember, under the Maccabee brothers, Judea broke away from the Seleucid kingdom. So Judea is not actually part of the Roman world yet. If Rome wants that, they're going to have to go get them. And they will. Rome is now the vast majority of the Mediterranean world. This is the end of the early republic, and Rome is almost as big as it's going to be. A few major exceptions. They don't have England yet. They don't have France yet. They don't have Jerusalem yet. So they're going to go get those. Julius Caesar in the 50s BC, I don't know why I'm doing that. In the 50s BC, Julius Caesar's going to go conquer Gaul and make the Romans feel so safe, because now the Celts can't come get them anymore. So yay, we love Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar went to go get Gaul partially because his biggest political ally / rival, frenemies, if you will, Pompey, in 63, a few years earlier, had conquered Jerusalem. And so now the Jews are part of the Roman world. From the beginning, Judea is a troubled province. A few things going on here. This is what I was changing this morning.
I saw you in there going.
Oh no, I saw you in there working on it too, and I was trying to do this in between the vomiting. Okay, so there's Judea, and we've got trouble in Judea. A few things going on. Number one, Rome, when they conquer an area, they set up a client king system. They appoint a local person of the local culture and religion to be a king of a territory. But that king answers to Rome, so Rome can have them removed from power. This is genius when it works, because this way Rome can respect local traditions. They get a little better idea of what the local customs are. And whenever possible, Rome really does try to let local people decide a lot of their own affairs internally. The problem is the client kings that Rome set up in Judea are horribly corrupt. This is Herod and his line. And there's a reason why Jesus used tax collectors doing good as a surprise twist ending in his stories, because the tax collection system was horribly flawed. You could pay for the right to be a tax collector, and then you were basically given free reign to go out and collect taxes. And you could collect whatever you could get out of people. And then you had to turn over the required amount. You pocketed the rest. And everybody knew this was going on, and the Romans didn't do anything about it. Now, in addition to that, there are food shortages that show up in Judea. Now, it's not like widespread cannibalism or anything, but I mean, that's pretty stressful when you go to market and you go daily and there's not enough food on the shelf, and you start wondering, what if there's no food tomorrow? What if there's no food the day after that? I mean, this is Judea. This is the land flowing with milk and honey. There should be enough food. But now that Rome is kind of redistributing things, there are some logistical problems with that, and there are some food shortages in Judea. Okay. Political problems, economic problems. Those are not a good combination. That makes for an uneasy population. And then it gets worse, because we've got military problems. Rome has conquered Judea, And on the border, on the other side of the border of Judea are the Parthians. Now the Parthians are the guys, they're in Iran, and they control trade with China through the Silk Road. So basically, I wonder if I can go back quickly. Yep, there we go. All right, if you look at the Roman world, the southern border is the Sahara Desert. Okay, that's not a risky border. The western border is the Atlantic Ocean. Not a risky border. The northern border, you would think, because we know that's the border that's going to fall eventually, but back in this point, that's not even a dangerous border either. That's pretty safe. If you were to ask a Roman in the late Republic, in the early Empire, what's the most vulnerable border, this is the border they would have said. Right there, because the Parthians are just on the other side. They're in Iraq, they're in Iran, they're powerful, they're organized, and Rome and the Parthians are periodically fighting each other. So this is where Judea is. It's right on, oops, we don't want to have Augustus come to power yet. Okay, so this is, if the Jews had been living, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I don't know, Spain, maybe Rome would have been a little more patient with them. Geography explains a whole lot in world history. But so we've got military issues, and then fourth, because why make things easy when we can make them super complicated? There are religious issues in Judea as well. First of all, the Jews are monotheistic, and from the Roman perspective, this is weird. This is weird. Now, but the Romans are like trying to be accommodating at first. Julius Caesar said Jews did not have to serve in the military. He recognized that there were dietary restrictions, there were Sabbath, there were rules about killing that the Romans would kill under certain circumstances that the Jews would have a problem with. And so that Julius Caesar said, it'll cause a revolt, we'll be nice about this, we can be accommodating, the Jews don't have to serve in the Roman military. The Romans recognized they've got this interesting group that they're going to have to make some exceptions for. And they tried, from the Roman point of view, initially to be accommodating. But trouble kept popping up. And that includes a religious fight over Jesus, whether or not Jesus was the Messiah. So Jesus appears into this and creates all kinds of problems, because there are a small group of Jews that think that Jesus is exactly who he says he is, and then there's a larger group of Jews who don't. And they're going to start having trouble with each other. And from the Roman perspective, I don't care, is the Roman perspective. Sit down and shut up. I don't believe in your God anyway. Quit fighting. Don't make me come back there, is basically the Roman point of view. And so things are escalating. Now, at this point, the story diverges a little. The Romans are going to have one set of interactions with the Jews who do believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and they're going to have another set of interactions with the Jews who don't. So we're going to take the story today, continuing through the Jews who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. And then we'll pick up with what happened to the Christians next week. So we got troubles in Judea. And really, we've got troubles all over Rome. The Roman government is bickering and complaining. There's a lot of infighting. They're all rich and powerful now, and they're fighting over who gets what. There's a very famous quote by the Roman writer Sallust, who said that Romans had easily borne hardship, struggle, danger. I'm misquoting, but that's basically what he says. But to them, leisure and riches proved to be burdens and torments. Rome, once all of their enemies were gone, Rome turned on itself. Without a common pressure of an enemy out there, they began bickering and fighting. I saw this week. We came together. We shut a whole city down to find that guy. Okay, I'm going to move on. So the Romans turned from a republic to an empire because amidst all the violence and chaos and infighting, Augustus seized power. And Augustus said, you know what, the voting system is not working right now, so no more voting. I'm going to rule for a while. That was actually constitutional if he had stopped that and gone back to voting, but he doesn't. But so Augustus seems to basically fix what's broken with Rome. He turns the economy around. He stopped the civil wars. Things seem to be better. What he's actually doing, though, is he's changing Rome from a republic to an empire. And for the next 500 years, power in Rome is going to be settled by dynastic succession or who can win it on the battlefield. No more voting. Now, in the early part of the empire, when the empire was running well, we've got a series of 3 dynasties in power. The first are the Julio-Claudians. Augustus was first. That's probably when Jesus was born. And Tiberius was second. That's when Jesus died. Caligula, well, we'll just skip him altogether. Claudius is the emperor who let Paul go. Okay? And then Nero is when the persecutions start. Now, all right, so here we go. The Jews are in turmoil. For most people, when they're conquered by Rome, their lives got better. That's not true in Judea. Their economy isn't better, their government isn't better, their military situation isn't better. Nothing is better. And they're mad. And there's a big group there's a very active group of Jews, the Zealots, who believe that when the Messiah comes, and he can't be Jesus because he's supposed to lead a rebellion against Rome, and all that talk about Messiah's got them fired up, and let's just go ahead and start that rebellion against Rome. And so the Jews begin to rebel. And under the rule of Nero, under the rule of Nero, there is a rebellion against Rome. The Romans are leading, or the Jews are leading kind of a Maccabean-style revolt. Only the Seleucid government is not the Roman government. And the Romans are going to come in, and they're going to put that rebellion down. There's a civil war, because Nero is so incompetent, so we have a year of 4 emperors, and that's never good. But the Flavians are going to take over. A guy named Vespasian settles the civil war, rules as emperor, openly declares himself, I'm an emperor, the republic's dead, long live the emperor. And then he marches into into Jerusalem, breaks the blockade, and destroys the city. The temple is destroyed in 70. Massive bloodbath. The amount of just civilian fatalities. It's horrific what happened in Jerusalem in 70. Perhaps you've seen this picture. This is of all the spoils being carried off, the ones that weren't destroyed. And then we get to the Antonines, the time of the 5 good emperors. Under Trajan, there's another rebellion, and it's brutally crushed. And then under Hadrian, there's another rebellion, and it's brutally crushed. And at this point, Rome decides enough. And in 135, they close the city of Jerusalem to the Jews. They erect a gigantic statue to the god Jupiter, which is their version of Zeus, right in the middle of the city, and the Jews are forced to scatter. They spread all over. We have records of Jews fleeing and going to China, India, Arabia. There's a reason why when Muhammad appears, he's interacting with Jews in Arabia, because a lot of families moved there after the diaspora. But a lot of them are going to move into Europe. And until 1948, Jews are not going to have a homeland and are going to live as a minority, at times persecuted in other countries, because going back to this event in 135. We will pick up more with what happened to the Jews throughout the diaspora and what was going on with the Christians at this time over the next 2 weeks. That's what we're talking about for the next 2 weeks. But for now, Tim has some things about the destruction.
You want to take us to the pretty slide?
Sure.
Why is this important? Understand, Christianity was at its very beginning in heart Jewish. So a lot of what impacted those early Christians, the early disciples of Jesus, really were the happenings for the Jewish nation and what was going on, some of the things Kelly was describing. I don't know if this quite looks like it or not, but that's supposed to be a representation of the temple. It was glorious. It was an amazing sight to be seen. It's actually, and so a little bit of back here, you may remember this, there was actually multiple temples. It actually started out with the tabernacle at Shechem that was where God lived in a tent. And David said, how can it be that God's living in a tent? And here I am in these wonderful palaces. But David couldn't build it, so Solomon did. But Solomon didn't build that one. Can you take us to the next slide? Remember, and this is actually a connection point to where you left off, Kelly, the dispersion, the peak there is actually how far Jews were even spread abroad, even in Jesus' time. So if we have the idea that the Jews were all in Israel, in Jesus' day and time, we're wrong. They weren't. They were, remember that there had already been the exiles. What happened with Assyria, which was a mess. What happened with Babylonia, and even returned. Not everybody returned. The Jews had already begun to spread out and be dispersed. Now let's go ahead and take us to, though, one important point. Jerusalem was still the center, though, of the Jewish identity. It was the city of the great king, Jerusalem. It was God's city. And in God's city, next slide, we'll see, actually going to zoom in here on part of that, there was a temple. Now this was Solomon's temple. And this was the temple before, the Babylonian exile, the destruction. This is the first temple, and a representation, the closest we can get from putting together pieces of scripture and descriptions, etc. But, Solomon's temple was the first. It was destroyed. Then another temple came. And it actually was Herod's temple. It's called Herod's temple not because he initiated actually you can call it the third, or you can call it 2.1 or something like this. It was a reboot. Remember that when Nehemiah came back to rebuild the wall, they worked on rebuilding the temple as well. And there was a reconstruction of the temple in that time. But Herod, as insane and vicious as he was, which is actually why the Romans loved him. They actually said it would be better to be, let me see if I get this quote right, it's better to be one of Herod's sheep or something, not sheep, pig. Be Herod's pig than to be his kid. Better to be Herod's pig than to be his kid, his child. Why? Well, Herod was Jewish. He converted. He was an Idumean, and but so he was a proselyte. He was not as Jewish as many of the Jews would want to see, but he was Jewish. So he wouldn't eat pork. So better to be his pig than his child, which he killed his children. He slaughtered his own children. He was paranoid. He was insane. And they loved that he was so violent. He would just slaughter people, even if he thought you didn't agree with him. Just a drop of a hat. But one of the things, the people who do love Herod, let me tell you who loves Herod. Biblical archaeologists love Herod. He is the king of archaeology. He did more building in Judea than anyone else. It was amazing the things he did. And this temple he constructed was one of the ones. He basically took what had been the temple constructed in Nehemiah's time and reconstructed it. To the extent that he expanded it. Go to the next one. That temple space itself, he created an entire temple area, the Temple Mount. And he did that by essentially carving up the mountain that it was built on top of and using stones from it to create this amazing edifice around the temple itself. And if you look, so see the little black square, the itty bitty black square in the lower corner there? See that? That's the size of a football field. So just for comparison's sake of what Herod built. So you see the outline of the temple size. It's an idea to give you the scale of what he did. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of scale, a couple of other things. These blocks show you a comparison of the different temples. So the first, and I don't know if I can see that. Can we zoom in on the very top? I think that's is that the tabernacle?
It is.
Tabernacle. Okay, tabernacle up to Solomon's temple. Got a little growth going on. Let's go on down. Well, there's a football field, so a little bigger than Solomon's temple. But then you go to Herod's temple again, and that's just the temple, not even the Temple Mount. Remember, not the big space, just the temple space was bigger than the football field. And then Ezekiel's temple, not for this class. That's a whole other discussion. That's even bigger, but that's for the future. So we'll talk about that later. Let's go to the next slide. So there's another comparison. Solomon's on the left, Herod's on the right. But the temple was immensely important for the Jews. Why? It's where God lived. This is where God lived. In fact, we can go to the next slide. It's not my favorite, but in the destruction of Jerusalem, there's a story about how the Roman general actually went into the temple before they destroyed it. He went in, he slammed his fist down on the altar, and he said, "I'm a king. You're a king too. Let's do battle." And he tears down the temple. You're a Jew, or even a Christian, and you see this. Maybe not the general himself, but you see what happens to God's city. I mean, remember all of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. What happened? God ordered the Israelites, go in, wipe out cities, because I am God. What's happened to your God? Where is he? Well, Rome's God must, or gods, God even in the form of the emperor, must be greater because he's destroyed the God of the Jews. This is what's going through your mind. Certainly what's going through the mind of all the Gentiles, if you will, at this time. And this was a bloodbath. I think you said it. I mean, and it was what, even the sadness around it. It's not like the people inside the city of Jerusalem were unified. There were different groups that were fighting each other during this time. One of the groups set fire to all the supplies in the city so that the other groups would be forced to fight. So they were starving in the city. They'd set fire to their own things. They were trying to go out at night, go out and scavenge. Each day, the Romans would catch about 500 people like that. They'd take them, crucify them outside the walls of the city so they could see them. Women, children, men, didn't matter. It was a bloodbath. There were hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of corpses thrown over the walls as people died. This is what's in your mind and vision and your concept of the world and your God as you go through this. Where is God? Where is God? This created a lasting impression. It changed the Jews forever. It had an impact on Christianity too, a significant one. But it changed things forever. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go and answer the question of why. Zoom in a little bit for me on that. Israel had built its sort of house, its belief system, one of actually pride on some concepts and some truths that they sort of pushed out of the realm of what they were meant to be applied in. God had covenants with Israel. Abraham's covenant, the covenant with David, the covenant with Israel itself from Moses. It was composed in the law and there. These were covenants that said, and remember, a covenant's not just a simple agreement of, you do this, I'll do this. It really is a relational statement that I will be there. And so they built their belief system around these covenants. They also built it, though, two other of those pillars were the land. This was the promised land. This was their land, designated by God for them. And that couldn't be changed by man. This was by God. And one other thing. They saw God come into the temple in Jerusalem and take residence. They saw the Shekinah glory come in and reside in their midst. An amazing thing. How can you not remember the deliverance from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the crossing of the Jordan, the defeat of the nations, the enthronement of the Davidic kingdom, and even with what happened with Babylonia, the promises of God that were fulfilled and delivered in a greater temple and nation even built. How can you not know these things and then see the destruction and have your faith challenged? But let's keep going. You remember this group? Sanhedrin? You know where they came from? Good question. You see them in the Gospels, right? You don't see them in the Old Testament, do you? It's not? Not really. Some of what we have to understand about how this happens has to do with the people's beliefs as well as their leadership and what their leaders told them. So in the Sanhedrin, these were the judges of Israel. These were the ones, so there is a line that they would trace back and say, you know, we actually do trace ourselves back to Moses. And actually we'll go to the next one. Maybe we'll even see Moses. And we trace it back, well, we'll see him in a second. And we trace it back through something we call Shmiha, which is the appointment, the anointing, the ordination of us as leaders, as teachers of the law, as representatives and judges. And this was this is the same term used for rabbis even today. You don't see the term rabbi in the Old Testament either. You see teacher, but not rabbi. And we'll get to rabbi in a second. But this is the appointment, if you will. And in fact, we do see some of this. We see this in the Old Testament. Let's keep going. And this is what the Sanhedrin, those in the Sanhedrin claim to have had passed down. This is Moses. And he laid his hands on Joshua and appointed Joshua as his successor. Okay, laid his hands on, laying on of hands. This is what the Sanhedrin and those of the Sanhedrin believed that they were representatives of. That this had been passed on to them. Why? Well, it wasn't just Joshua. Let's keep going. It was actually, if we go back to Numbers, we see that there were 70 elders who Moses actually called and appointed. And actually, if we actually look at the quote, and I think the quote's next. Let's go to the pretty famous, but let's go to the quote. The quote from Numbers actually says, the Lord said to Moses, "Gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, who you know to be elders of the people and officers over them." Now listen carefully. "Bring them to the tent of meeting," this is the tabernacle, "and let them take their stand there with you. And I will come down and talk with you there. And I will take some of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them. And they shall hear the burden, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you will not bear it alone by yourself." And I don't really know if you remember this. I mean, it's a sort of, it may be obscure. It's a book of Numbers. You have to read through all the Torah to get some of these stories. But this is the idea of the laying on, of passing on, laying on of hands, the Spirit, and even the passing on of the Spirit and some of the power that God gives from one to another. And this is what the Sanhedrin, the leaders of Israel, claimed as their power and why they have authority. This is the authority they claimed. And you may remember some conversations with Jesus about authority. We'll get to that. On whose authority? Do you? Oh, teach. Well, let me ask you a question. On what authority did John the Baptist teach? So there's some interesting conversations that go on about Shmiha, about authority, about the laying on of hands, about the ordination, if we want to use that word, of these leaders. Let's keep going. And this also, there's a matching concept. So we have this ordination, this laying on of hands, this power of leadership. But we also have something else, and it's more in the form of what can be termed discipleship. Remember Elijah and Elisha? Go back and read that story if you need to. It's in the book of Kings. You can go to it and read it. What happened is Elijah the prophet lays his cloak over Elisha and essentially says, "You're it, buddy, congratulations." And Elisha says, "Well, can I go kiss my folks goodbye?" And Elijah says, "Hey, whatever." That was the translation. You can look at it. So what Elisha does at that point is amazing. He had 12 yoke of oxen that he was plowing filled. It's a bunch of meat. So to show that he was serious about following Elisha, he slaughtered them all, held a big party for everybody. So he was a farmer, held a big party, sold all the stuff. It's all gone. It's yours. That's it. I'm done.
I'm out of here.
And he followed Elijah. He became Elijah's disciple. And while the term rabbi wasn't applied then, this is what became, when you read in the New Testament, of the term and where it came from. The idea of a disciple following someone. The term Torah teachers was used as well. These were men who would know the Torah. And even the men with Shmiha who were appointed maybe judges would respect a Torah teacher, especially if they knew more than they did. There was an awareness of individual insight into the law of Moses. Rabbi, which we see in the New Testament, was sort of first came not long before Jesus, actually, in that intertestamental period. In that time, it started being applied And then it became formalized later, actually, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the destruction of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin in Jerusalem destroyed as well. Who leads? Who rules? Where are the judges? They're dead. What do we do? And this is where after Jesus and after the destruction, the rabbis actually formed more of even a legal system in court for helping to run a nation that was in shreds. Let's keep going. So I put the Greek over on the right. If there's Greek scholars in the room, you can look at that. I'm really not concerned about that right now. I'm concerned with master and disciples, rabbi and talmid. And the term for rabbi, we talked about, that's the Hebrew word if you want to see it. The term for talmid, we still need to talk a little bit about, because that may be what you want to be called. Maybe. If you want to be an Elisha, following an Elijah, or following Moses. It's interesting those two appear with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, isn't it? Sort of start pulling some things together. Let's keep going. So, I don't know what your picture of a rabbi is. I don't know if it's like this, walking sort of out there in the wild. I covered up the face so that you couldn't actually see it. If it's probably, I don't know, the face may look a lot like yours. You may project that, I don't know. But it probably didn't. It was probably much different looking than your eye. But Jesus was a rabbi. He was a leader. He was a teacher. He was a Torah teacher. And he had shmiha. He had authority. And the authority was confusing to those others who were saying they had authority. Where do you get your authority? We already talked about that conversation. But he also had talmidim, actually. That's the plural. And where did he get them? You remember Elisha killed his oxen, burned them, went and had a feast. Jesus also called, he didn't call farmers, he called fishermen. But he called them from their jobs, and they followed him. And they left their nets, and they left their boats. I don't think they sunk them, but anyway, they left them, and they followed him. The word for our day is talmid. It's actually the one in the corner up here. Actually, y'all aren't looking over your shoulders. It's up here. Talmid, and it means disciple. Talmid. Let's go to the next one. I think the last question we want to ask, and this will lead to our challenge as we wrap up, is what does it mean to be a disciple? Because I would suspect, given all that we've talked about during this spring, that if we've had to learn a lot about what it meant to be Jewish, and what it meant for Jesus to be Jewish, we probably have a lot to learn about what it meant to be a disciple of a Jewish rabbi, a talmid of a rabbi. In fact, I suspect that if we were to walk behind Jesus like his disciples did, if we were to live with him, sleep with him for 3 years, as they did, we might think differently than we do now. I might think and live differently than I do today. So in the remaining weeks, we want to try to catch that vision of what that means. What does it mean to be a disciple? And do we really want to fill out that job application? The fishermen who Jesus would have recruited, by the way, on their job application probably had a lot more credibility in terms of what they knew of Torah. They had most of it memorized. And certainly Jesus did. At 12, he was debating and talking about Torah in the temple. That means he would have had it here already. We have a long ways to go. But we can follow. We can follow this rabbi. No, that's good. Here's a challenge. How can people tell that I'm a disciple? We're going to talk more about what disciples are and what it means. But how, just today, in your life, in my life, how do they know? I'm with 10 other people in the lineup. How do they know I'm a disciple of Jesus? This is where we'll really dig in. Disciples, they were known because they looked like their rabbi. Do I look like my rabbi? to stop there or else I'm going to be in trouble. So
A whole different
we're going to
thing.
stop there and we'll pick it up and talk much more about what that looks like next week.